How's it going, everybody? My name is... Oh, wait, no, wait. How's it going, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Keeping the Faith podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Fuentes, and this is my co-host, Edgar Martinez.
Hey, what's up, guys?
We have a very interesting episode for you guys here today, but before we jump into that, we just want to remind you guys that you guys can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Feel free to also leave us a like on our Facebook page to keep up to date with anything that we're doing. But having said that, let's go ahead and continue into this week's episode because we have a very interesting one. Edgar, why don't you give him a little rundown about what we're going to talk about?
Yeah, so in our previous episode, we went over the trial of Jesus. We pretty much read a few verses from all four Gospels and how that happened. And so at the end, he was delivered to Pilate, and Pilate, even though he didn't really had the evidence, but because of pressure and he just want to maintain peace, he pretty much sentenced Jesus to be crucified. And so for today's episode, that is what we're going to talk: Jesus' crucifixion. And so let's get to it. So the very first verses that we have, it's in Matthew chapter 27, verses 27 through 31. So this is I kind of put it this way. It's pretty much the preparation for before Jesus' crucifixion. So it says, then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole battalion before him, and they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head, and put a reed in his right hand. And kneeling before him, they mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they spit on him, and took the reed struck him on the head. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe, and put his own clothes on him, and led him away to crucify him. And so then we can read also in Matthew 27, that same chapter, 33 through 54. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it actually tells us the place where Jesus was crucified. And it says in verse 33, it says, "And when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull, then it says they offered him wine to drink mixed with gall, but when he tasted it, he would not drink it." So I did want to reference this verse because it tells us where it was, and I believe there's two places now in Jerusalem where it's where they say it might have been that Golgotha place, but there's one in particular where there's a stronger view of it that was the actual place, and I believe there's even a church there. So yep, that's why I wanted to reference this. And so one other thing that I got reminded right now, it's that in that 34, when it says that they offered him wine, there was a Jewish tradition where women would give wine, but it was mixed with some poison so that whoever was being crucified would die peacefully in the cross, and so I guess it would be best that way than having to suffer all the hours being in the cross. So this is one of the reasons why we can see that in the towards the end of verse 34, where it says he would not drink it. So basically, he knew what might have happen if he was to drink that. So he needed to take the full punishment in that cross. So that's one thing. And again, that's just that was a Jewish tradition where they gave mixed wine with poisons so that they can die faster.
Yeah, very good points there, Edgar. Now we're actually going to jump into the instruments of torture that were used on Jesus. Now, when we actually studied this is actually very interesting because a lot of people could undersell just how bad the torture was that Jesus went through. And when we actually look at some of the instruments that were used for his flogging, we can see just how bad this really was. One of the main instruments that they used, it goes under one or two names, either a flagrant or I forgot what the other one was called, but I know it has two names. But essentially, it's just like a whip that has like these spikes at the end of it. And what these spikes were meant to be used was to actually reach into the skin and pull skin off of the body. And this is what they used when they were flogging Jesus, when they tied him up and just, lashed him in the back. Something very interesting to note here is there's a lot of debate on how many times Jesus was actually flogged. And that's because in the Old Testament, it was custom for Jews to be able to flog someone 40 times. And that's something that was directly commanded from God. And the thing is, so whenever they would flog people, they would only hit them 39 times because they really didn't want to risk if the person counting lost track. If they were like, 24, 25, 25, 26, 27. And if you're going exactly for 40 and you hit them one extra time, like you're receiving direct punishment from God because you disobeyed that law, which is why they would only hit someone 39 times. However, it's important to remember here that the Jews themselves weren't doing the flogging or the lashing, but this was actually coming directly from the Roman soldiers, and they had no such rule. So Jesus could have been flogged 40 times or more. I mean, most likely they flogged him more than 40 times, but I just wanted to bring that up because a lot of people do like to bring up that Jesus was probably only flogged 39 times, but in reality, Jesus could have been flogged 100 times or more. The thing is, we don't know, but Jesus really truly was tortured while he was being lashed there, and it's just important to know a lot of the suffering that Jesus went through for us and to remember.
Yeah, and you know what? That's interesting that you mentioned that, because then following up in the Bible in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 23, verses 26 through 27, we can see, or at least we can kind of give a picture of how that torture was against Jesus, because he even needed some help from someone else. So it says, "And as they led him away, they seized on Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, and laid on him the cross to carry it behind Jesus. And there followed him a great multitude of the people and of women who were mourning and lamenting for him." So, I mean, they even, the Romans saw how Jesus, was probably not able to carry the cross all the way to the hill. So they needed someone else. So, and that's where Simon of Cyrene enters in the picture. So, but that just gives us a glance of what type of punishment Jesus had, like physical punishment. Of course, then we'll see the spiritual punishment. But now we can see that how intense that might have been. And you just said it, Jonah, with the description you just gave of the instruments that they used. Man, I've seen even a few more, like documentaries about Romans. Man, they were monsters with torturing and all that. I even saw this part where it says, the Romans didn't actually invented the crucifixion, but they perfected that. So it's like, wow, that's pretty insane.
Yeah, like you said, they really knew what they were doing. They were masters of crucifixion. But that actually leads us into the next part here.
Yeah, and so then following up with this story here, then that takes us once they get there. And one of the things that Romans would do, or Roman soldiers more specifically, is that they would lay down the victim in the cross. And so that's when they would start putting the nails in the hands and the feet. And so I think one thing to kind of mention here is because I've seen these drawings a lot where they put the nails in the actual palm of the hand. And that's actually not accurate, because if you were to put that nail there, with the weight of the body would just, the hand would just ripped off from the nail. So that's actually not accurate. A better description of that is where they put the nail in the wrist instead of the palm, because the wrist has more support on it, and so that's how they would do it. And this is just because I've seen a lot of drawings, a lot of pictures where they display Jesus having the nails in the palm, and that's not even accurate.
Yeah, it's actually a very good point there, Edgar. All right, that leads us into what we're going to talk about next, which is Pilate's writing on the cross. Now, this is actually very interesting. Edgar and I were talking about this before the podcast, and that's because in every single gospel, this account is actually documented. However, it's in all gospels where they actually say something different. And a lot of skeptics and unbelievers will use this to point out how the Bible is unreliable, about how you can't trust it because they don't say the same thing. But when we actually look at what all of them say individually, we can see that the overarching, it has one overarching message, and each part of the gospel just chooses to focus on one specific part. And the one what we're going to talk about today is in John 19:20, which this one says, verse 20 through 22, it says, "This title then read many of the Jews, for the place where Jesus was crucified was nigh to the city, and it was written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. And said the chief priest to the Jews to Pilate, Write not the King of the Jews, but that he said, I am the King of the Jews. Pilate answered, What I have written, I have written." So Pilate pretty much said, look, I know you guys don't agree with the message I put, but this is what's going to happen. And essentially, the Jews didn't want it to say, here lies the King of the Jews, but that Jesus just claimed to be the King of the Jews. But Pilate was firm in what he said, because like how we talked about last week, Pilate wasn't convinced that Jesus was guilty of anything. So he wanted to really make a point where he stood on the whole thing, regardless of how the Jews, felt about the sign. Obviously they didn't agree. They didn't believe that he was the King of the Jews, but just that he claimed to be. But Pilate, he was firm in his decision, and that's just something very interesting. But now if we jump over, and this is where it gets very interesting when it comes to prophecy, because the truth is, there's a lot of prophecy when it comes to what happened to Jesus on the cross, and this is one of the more interesting ones that we have to talk about, which if we go to Psalms 22 verse 1, this is actually a prophetic verse about what is going to happen to Jesus while he's being crucified. And it says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why art thou so far from helping me and from the words of my roaring? And if we jump over to Matthew 27:46, it says, And about the 9th hour Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani? That is to say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? So we can see that Jesus is actually making reference here to Psalms 22. And the reason behind that is, this is actually something interesting that I always bring up a lot. The Jews were very familiar with the Old Testament. And they knew when somebody had to reference something, they couldn't just say, Exodus 10 verse 35, because the Old Testament at the time didn't have those numbers. So in order to make reference to something, they would have to actually repeat the verse, or, the story about Moses and the burning bush. They would actually have to make real references instead of just quoting Bible verses by the numbers. So when Jesus says this on the cross, all the Jews in the crowd are thinking, wait a minute, that sounds familiar. And then they know to go to Psalms 22 verse 1, where they could read the whole thing and read that Jesus is actually fulfilling the prophecy here. And I just think that's very interesting, because this is just one of the many prophecies that Jesus fulfilled on the cross.
Yeah, and it's pretty interesting. If you guys or are looking at prophecy, we got another one right here. So in Psalms 22, that same chapter that Jonah just read, but verses 14 to 16, we also have another one. And this one says, I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within my breast. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death, for dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet. And then if we go to John 19:28 through 37, we can also see actually this prophecy being fulfilled. So it says, after this, Jesus, knowing that all was now finished, said to fulfill the scripture, I thirst. A jar full of sour wine stood there. So they put a sponge full of the sour wine on a hyssop branch and held it up to his mouth. When Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, it is finished. And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Since it was the day of preparation, and so the bodies would not remain on the cross for the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day. The Jewish asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. So the soldiers came to break the legs of the first and of the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. He who saw it has borne witness. His testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, that you also may believe. For these things took place that the scripture might be fulfilled. Not one of his bones will be broken. And again, other scripture says, they will look on him whom they have pierced. So that just gets us back to Psalms 22, where the prophecy was there. And one thing that I also heard, it's about Jesus' death and the cross. So it wasn't, I believe, maybe you might correct me on this one, Jonah, but I believe it was about 4 to 6 hours, or maybe a little bit more, where they were hanged in the cross, because it was a slow death. That was the whole goal of that kind of death, to suffer for a long period of time. But Jesus, it's told that he didn't suffer the whole time, but that just because of all the pain maybe he was suffering. And so yeah, that's one of the things. But as you can see, this is just prophecy, and prophecy being fulfilled over and over. And this is just two that we right now have.
Something that just came to mind too, speaking of this verse, talking about it still, is that based on what you were saying just right now, the Romans did this because they wanted them to be out of breath. Essentially, the way that they were crucified was in a position where they would have no problem breathing in, but they had a hard time to breathe out because of the way that their bodies was positioned on the cross, because it was hanging forward. And when you're hanging forward, you can breathe in, but you have a hard time breathing out, or vice versa. I actually forget. But essentially, this is one of the ways that you would die on the cross, was by asphyxiation, which is when you just can't breathe anymore. And one of the ways that that the Romans would deal with this is by breaking the legs. Because the thing is, in order to breathe in, you'd have to push up on your legs to be able to breathe in. But what were to happen if they were to break your legs? Well, if they break your legs, you won't be able to breathe in anymore. Which is why even Pilate was surprised that, wait, Jesus is dead already? Because they were planning to break his legs so that way he could just die faster, based on what Edgar was saying, or based on the verse that he was reading. Since it was the Sabbath, it was unlawful for them to leave bodies hanging up on the Sabbath, so they had to take it down before the next day. And I just think that's very interesting that, like how Joe was saying, Jesus was already dead, and that's why his bones weren't broken, thus at the same time fulfilling the prophecy that he read in Psalms.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, Roman soldiers, because this is one thing, at least for the Muslims, that they do say in the Quran that Jesus didn't really die, that it only appeared that he was dead. But I mean, Roman soldiers were there, like Jonah said, they had to break the legs because they needed them to die like quicker. But they weren't gonna leave no one just, like, oh, he's half dead, so I guess he might die later on, just put him down. No, they had to make sure they were dead before they actually were able to put him down, because it was either they were the people crucified, it was either they were dead or else the soldiers might be killed because they weren't doing their duty. So this is just just to say that crucifixion wasn't a thing where I guess they're half dead, we can just kind of leave them. No, it was, or they were dead or dead. That there was only one way of getting down that cross.
Yeah, that was a good point, Edgar. But yeah, like you said, we maybe jumped the gun a little bit, because the next verse that we're going to read is actually in John 19, verse 26, that says, "When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciples whom he loved standing by, or the disciple whom he loved standing by, he said to her, 'Woman, here is your son.'" Now, this is actually kind of important for a lot of different reasons. One of the things that we were talking about earlier is that I think most Protestants will agree that Mary did have other sons besides Jesus. I know in the Catholic tradition that's not allowed. But the thing is here, there's a reason that Jesus was saying this to Mary about John, who in this verse, for those of you guys who don't know, in the book of John, every time the disciple whom he loved is referenced, he's always talking about himself. So he never actually says, the disciple John. He always says the disciple whom he loved. And the thing is, Mary had other sons and daughters that could have taken after him or taken care of her after Jesus had passed. But the thing is, Jesus wanted to make sure or ensure that his mother was well taken care of. And that had to be with someone who also believed that he was the Messiah, because he was speaking the truth in that sense. It's not necessarily that they had to believe just that he was the Messiah, but that they had to believe the truth that he was the Messiah. So the thing is, he knew that his brothers and sisters didn't believe that he was the Messiah. And this is something that we get from other texts in the verse where it says that Mary and her sons came to visit Jesus, and Jesus says, "Oh, who is my mother other than that who believes in God?" And same thing with his brothers. So essentially, long story short, he's saying that, my family are the people that believe in God, with me, my brothers and sisters in Christ. So Jesus wanted to make sure that his mother was taken care of by someone who also believed the truth, which in this case was John the disciple. So he wanted to make sure that his mother was well taken care of, even though she had other sons and daughters. But John actually believed the truth, and he knew that it was better for him to take care of her than his actual brothers and sisters.
Wow. That was, yeah, that was cool. I mean, I'm pretty sure there might be, other perspective on this, but I think that, that's a good explanation of why that was referenced, because it wasn't just referenced just because. I mean, it was because of a bigger thing. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, that pretty much just transitions again, where now Jesus said it is finished. So of course we just read where the bones were broken for the other two guys that were in the cross, and Jesus was already dead, and now Jesus told, before that, Jesus told John to take care of his mother. And then at the end, there's something really interesting that maybe not many actually explain, but it has a big impact whenever we're giving out the gospel, and more specifically for that time being. So when Jesus was about to die as I read in John 19 20 through 37, in 2028 he already knew it was already about to end. And so it says, to fulfill the scripture, I thirst. So he asked for the sour wine. And then in 30, it says, when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, it is finished. And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. So that's the end. And so many of us might, just go over that and might not remember those 3 words, but that actually has a legal implication inside. And I've heard this being explained by Ray Comfort from Living Waters, where when he's saying it is finished, basically he's saying the debt has been paid. So I have paid. And one way he explained it is like, imagine yourself, you're in court, and then the judge is telling you're going to go to jail because you've committed these crimes, and so you owe this much money if you want to go out. So you got to pay, and of course maybe you're not going to have the money, but then if somebody comes into place and and pays what you actually owe, the judge might tell you, you know what, you're the one that committed the crimes, but someone else paid the fine, so you're free to go. And so this is pretty much that same scenario in that place. He paid all the transgressions that we did, or at least the people at that time did, and now that we're doing. So he paid for all of that, and that's a key thing, that whenever we're giving out the gospel. And now I'm going into a different topic, I guess, but it's just that it's pretty interesting how he said 3 words, it is finished, and then pretty much that ended everything. And then in Matthew 27, we also see the centurion, and it says, Matthew 27 verse 54, it says, when the centurion and those who were with him keeping watch over Jesus saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe and said, truly, this was the Son of God. So, I mean, we can see here, they saw it. I don't know, but if you're there, you saw, all the sky going black, and you saw Jesus talking all these strange words that you might not take sense in that at the moment. Then there's an earthquake, and I mean, that just pretty much tells you something's going on with this guy here, And so that's why even the centurions, the Roman soldiers said, truly, this was the Son of God. So they actually acknowledge. I believe in one of the other gospels says that they got to the ground, and they got to their knees, referencing who Jesus was, So I mean, that just tells us that it wasn't just an ordinary event, so it was an extraordinary thing.
Yeah, that's very important too, because like you said, I mean, if the Roman guards acknowledged him, I mean, how evident was it that maybe he really was who he said he was, and it was just the hardening of everyone's heart that was not able to see that. So that's a really good point. But that leads us to the next thing that we have here, which is the actual burying of Jesus's body. So when Jesus' body was going to be buried, it was actually custom for bodies to be thrown in just a pit of other bodies. This is one objection that a lot of atheists or a lot of skeptics will make, that Jesus wasn't actually buried because it wasn't tradition for them to bury bodies. It was tradition to throw them in a pit of dead bodies and, let the dogs eat them or whatever. But whenever the disciples, but it was, they were able to make exceptions to this rule, which is what we see happened in Jesus' case. And in this case, it says that Joseph of Arimathea asked for Jesus' body and gave his own tomb. So since Joseph was a rich guy, they were more inclined to listen to him with this request. And we can actually read about this in John 19, verse 38 through 40, that says, "Later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. Now, Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because he feared the Jewish leaders. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 65 pounds. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with the spices in strips of linen. This was in accordance with Jewish burial customs." So this is just like more evidence to the idea that Jesus was actually buried. But also something that's very interesting is in Isaiah 53, there's actually a reference to this. Now, we will talk more about this later, but for those of you guys who don't know, Isaiah 53 is actually a prophecy of what's going to happen to Jesus. And if we focus on verse 9, it says, "He had done no wrong and had never deceived anyone, but he was buried like a criminal. He was put in a rich man's grave." Like we just talked about, and like how we read, Joseph was a rich man, and he gave up his own tomb for Jesus. So if he's a rich man, he has a rich tomb, and he gave his tomb for Jesus' burial, just like we read the prophecy in Isaiah 53:9. And I just think this is just one of those prophecies, again, how we're talking about, that was fulfilled. And this in this one, Jesus is dead and he's still fulfilling prophecies. And I just think that's that's interesting. But if we go over to Matthew 27:63 through 66, we actually have more that we have here about the security of the tomb. In verse 63, it says, "Sir," they said, "we remember that while he was alive, the deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise again.' So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he had been risen from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first." "Take a guard," Pilate answered. "Go make the tomb as secure as you can." So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard. Now here, there is a lot that can be said about the idea that a lot of people say that the disciples stole the body. But the thing is, here it's just interesting because there was security at the tomb. One of the ways that we can know that this is true is because in the story of Matthew, this was actually going around during the time of the events took place, or a few years afterwards. So imagine that you're a Jewish Pharisee and you read in the book of Matthew that this stuff happened, and you're like, wait a minute, we never said that. How easy is it to dismay a rumor from the book of Matthew unless it actually happened? If this hadn't happened, they could easily just throw it away and say, look, we never said that never happened. Don't believe these people, they're just writing lies. But the fact that this is in it and it's not contested by any other source goes to show that they really did send soldiers to guard the tomb. Now here you have Roman soldiers guarding a tomb. What are disciples, fishermen, gonna do to put up a fight against Roman guards to steal a tomb? I mean, a lot, like I said, this is just a lot of objections that you hear from skeptics. Even the Jewish leaders, in their own sources and their own books, realizing that they had to have some sort of answer for Jesus' missing body, they'll say stuff like, yeah, the disciples stole the body. But there's absolutely nothing that the disciples were going to be able to do against real trained Roman killers. I think is an accurate way of describing them, because I mean, if anyone's ever seen any movie on like the Romans or any documentaries, you knew how tough these people were, and there's nothing that the disciples are going to be able to do against them. And I just think it really goes to show that, if the accounts of Jesus are true, you have to take this into account. You can't just say that Jesus never was put in the tomb. You can't say that there was no one protecting it, that the disciples just went and stole the tomb. You have to take this into account and still try to come up with an explanation that Jesus wasn't actually raised on the third day. And I think under those circumstances, it's impossible to do.
Yeah, and you know what? I just remember about an argument with this, because there's many people that might say, well, you know what? Maybe they weren't Roman soldiers that were guarding the tomb. Maybe it was, a different guard. And so, okay, let's give that, okay, let's say it was the Jewish leaders' guards that they had from the Sanhedrin. Let's say it was them, but it still doesn't make sense. Like, it still doesn't make it better for whoever's making that argument, because if it was the guard from the Jewish leaders, they should have been instructed, nobody enters, or nobody would come out with no body from this tomb. It has to be guard, because it was a place of interest for the Jewish leaders. And so if it was from Roman soldiers, that as well doesn't even make a good argument either, because now we're talking about Roman soldiers. If they were to miss at their duties, they will be killed. And so, I mean, either way you want to take it, either it was the Roman guards or the Jewish leader guards, whoever it was, they had interest in the body of Jesus not coming out. So whichever it was, because it's just that I've heard this argument, and I mean, they just put out their arguments. I'm not saying it's a dumb argument or anything like that, but I mean, it doesn't disprove that the disciples actually took the body. It was impossible. Whichever of the two guards it was, they were not going to let them pass.
Yeah, that's a good point. And like you said, even if it was Jewish guards, I mean, there was a seal on the tomb that was protecting it. And if we actually look back to like the Romans, this was a Roman seal. And if people knew, like if they saw a Roman seal and they were to mess with it, like they would have the full wrath of like the Roman army, the Roman government on them. So the disciples, I mean, even if it was Jewish leaders, if something happened to the seal, those Jewish guards would be punished as well from the Romans, even the disciples themselves. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot that can be said about this, but I guess at the end of the day, the tomb had security. Jesus was put into the tomb, and those who say that the disciples stole the body or anything like that, I mean, there's just a lot of stuff that they have to like explain that I think makes it really implausible to say otherwise.
And you know what? I even heard Frank Turek said something like, because the Jewish leaders actually were the ones that kind of put up a story where it says that the disciples stole the body, right? While the guards were asleep. And so he's Frank Turek said, what? If the guards were asleep, how did they knew it was the disciples? Weren't they sleeping? It's like, what? What happened there? So, I mean, it's just to say, how foolish they were into just making lie over lie over lie to make, themselves look good and to not lose any credibility and power. Because at the end of the day, the Jewish people wanted power, the Roman people wanted power, and it was just a battle of who can make the best lies to keep the power and the money and the comforts they had.
Yeah. So with that being said, Edgar, I mean, we pretty much did it. We covered a lot of what happened on the cross. The truth is, I mean, there's so much more that can be said. The thing is, we could easily make this over an hour long podcast, diving deep into references from the Old Testament and just more about the crucifixion itself. And maybe even one day, maybe like in Easter, we can go back and talk about this a little bit more. But there's so much that can be said. There's a lot that we missed out on. And this is just one of the joys of studying this topic is, you learn more and more about fulfilled prophecy, about references to the Old Testament, about what kind of things they put Jesus through. And I know Edgar and I both love studying this, and this is just a very fascinating topic to talk about and explore.
Yeah, definitely. And at the end of the day, this was a huge impact to anyone who knew Jesus at that point. Friends, disciples, family. This was a big thing, and even people that might have not, necessarily had spoken with Jesus directly, but they knew about who he was, right? The teachings, and so at the end of the day, it was a loss for them because they thought of Jesus, being the Messiah, being this king that would, remove the Romans and just get everything back how it was. So that was, we talked about this, how Jews viewed how the Messiah was gonna come, and so it was just a loss. They were like, oh well, just another prophet who died, and of course they felt bad, they felt sad because they thought this was the one, but they actually did not know what was about to follow next, and that's what we're going to talk in our next podcast. But yeah, definitely that was a good story or a good podcast. So I don't know. Do you have any other thing to say, Jonah? Now I'm kind of reverting your words.
Any final words? No, I think we did a good job. I'm looking forward to the next episode. Like you said, a lot of them were sad that Jesus has died, but little did they know what was going to happen next with the resurrection. And I'm looking forward to talking about that next week. But with that being said, thank you guys for checking out this week's episode of the podcast. Remember that you guys can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Also, feel free to leave us a like on our Facebook page at Keeping the Faith Podcast, where we could interact with you, any comments, questions that you guys may have. Also, one thing that we haven't mentioned in a while is we are actually building towards an episode where we're going to answer you guys' questions. So if you guys have any questions about either stuff that we've talked about or maybe just Christianity in general, feel free to leave it in the comments on our Facebook or on our YouTube, and that way we can gather enough questions to make a proper podcast episode. But with that being said, thank you guys so much for listening. Take care, and God bless.
Later.